Hi, everyone. My name is David J. Kent, and in this week is a celebration of my release of my new book, which is called Lincoln in New England in Search of His Forgotten Tours. I'm talking about just a little bit of background about each of the six New England states and what the connections are between them and to Lincoln. Now, I mentioned last night that Lincoln went to New England twice in his lifetime. On neither occasion did he go to two of those states, Maine, which I covered in the last video, and Vermont, which I'm going to talk about tonight. Now, Vermont actually was not one of the 13 original states. It came in as the 14th state, and it came in directly as a free state. Most of the northern states had been slave states, just like everybody was in as a colony, and they slowly, gradually, most of them got rid of slavery. But Vermont came in free of slavery. They started as a free state. Now, Lincoln didn't go there, but there is actually a Lincoln, Vermont, except it's not named after Abraham Lincoln, as you would think. And a lot of these Lincolns are not named after Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, Vermont is named after Benjamin Lincoln. And Benjamin Lincoln was George Washington's second in command. And in fact, it was Benjamin Lincoln who accepted the surrender of the British General Cornwallis at Yorktown. Now, there's an interesting connection here in a couple of ways. First off, Benjamin Lincoln is a distant relative of Abraham Lincoln. He's a couple of times removed, and I talk about the details in the book. But Benjamin Lincoln's house in Hingham, Massachusetts, is directly across the street from the Samuel Lincoln house in Hingham, Massachusetts. Samuel Lincoln is Lincoln's direct ancestor. From Samuel Lincoln through quite a few steps, you get to Abraham Lincoln directly. So there's definitely a connection there. So there are some other connections, where Vermont is important to Lincoln. When we think of Vermont these days, especially if we think about politicians, we think of Bernie Sanders as the senator from Vermont, which is interesting because he was born in New York City. On the other hand, we think of Stephen A. Douglas as being from Illinois, but he was actually born in Vermont. John Deere, the great inventor of the steel plow and several other things, he was also born in Vermont, even though we think of him as being from Illinois, which is where he did most of his inventing. But he grew up and spent his early life until he was about 32 years old. He was living in Vermont, where he was born. Now, there's a couple other people I'll mention because they're important people, even though their connection with Lincoln is kind of fuzzy. And they're also presidents, Chester A. Arthur and Calvin Coolidge. Now, Chester A. Arthur served in the Civil War. He was from New York. He served as a brigadier general, and he was the quartermaster for the state of New York. So he never fought in a battle. He mainly stayed in New York, but he was the one who got all of the supplies out to the New York regiments. So he was very important to the Civil War, even though he didn't fight down in there. It was people like Garfield that fought. The other, Calvin Coolidge, obviously didn't fight in the Civil War because he was much later. He was born after the Civil War in 1872. And his connection is kind of interesting because Calvin Coolidge was vice president to Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding was the president on May 30th, 1922, when the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated. So there was former President Taft, who is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There was Warren G. Harding as president, and there was Robert Lincoln there for the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. And then Harding died about a year and a half later while still in office, and Coolidge became the president. And I don't think Coolidge was at the Lincoln Memorial. But I thought that was kind of cool because in 2022, so the 100th year anniversary, I actually had the privilege of emceeing the centennial celebration, the rededication of the Lincoln Memorial right there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So I kind of, felt a little close to Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge and Abraham Lincoln. There's one other guy that I want to mention who's from Vermont and is very important to Lincoln, and that's Justin Morrill. You remember I mentioned Lawton Morrill in the main one. This is a relative of his from Vermont. He was in the House of Representatives during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he became a senator, and he was a senator for 31 years for Vermont until he died in office. Justin Morrill is the author of the Morrill Land Grant College Act, which Lincoln signed into law, and Lincoln was very much in support of. The Land Grant College Act requires, it gives land, federal land, and monies to each individual state, and it was extended into all the southern states when they were reconstructed back in. Every state would get land on the stipulation that they put a school there, or a college, and that college was required to teach science and technology. So it would teach agricultural science and mechanical technology, which is why some of these schools, like Texas A&M, have that A&M in the name, because they were required to teach the science and bring the science into mainly it was agriculture at that time, but also manufacturing and some other things. So that led to institutionalizing science and technology into education and into the government. So Justin Morrill was the impetus behind that. But there's another reason why Justin Morrill is important. Justin Morrill in 1864 proposed, introduced, and pushed through passage of the bill to take the old House of Representatives room where Lincoln had served when he was a congressman and turn that room into Statuary Hall. So now we go into Statuary Hall, and there's a little plaque in the back of that room that says Abraham Lincoln's. This is where his desk was, because that's the room that was the House of Representatives when Lincoln was a congressman in 1848. Well, by the time Lincoln was president, they needed more space, and so they built to the end of the Capitol a bigger House of Representatives and a bigger Senate, which is what they use today. So Morrill said, well, I think we should use this room. Let's put a bunch of statues in there. And now every state can put 2 statues representing people from their state into Statuary Hall. And there's not enough room for all of them, so they all go into, some of them go into other places in the Capitol building. So that was part of what was doing there. And again, this is something that I mentioned in the book because I had the privilege again of participating in the ceremony that turned a room just off Statuary Hall into the Lincoln Room. And this was a room that was the post office at the time. Lincoln used to hang out there. He would tell jokes and stories. And so I was part of the Lincoln Group of DC, and there was several other groups that were involved in turning this into the Lincoln Room when it was dedicated several years ago. So I was privileged to be there. So that was Justin Morrill. Now, while Lincoln never visited Vermont, he actually almost did, or he was scheduled to go. So Mary Lincoln, who after Willie had died in early 1862, hated to be in Washington during the summer, in particular when it was very hot and pestilence. Lincoln would go up to the old soldiers' home, which is now called President Lincoln's Cottage here in Washington, D.C. Mary would travel and get away from it. So she went up to the Jersey Shore, she went up to Boston, and she went up to Manchester, Vermont. And in Manchester, Vermont, she stayed in the Equinox Hotel, which I'll talk more about in a second. So she went up in 1863, and she was accompanied by Tad and by Mrs. General Abner Doubleday. And Doubleday, neither the general nor his wife invented baseball. That's a myth. He didn't actually invent it. But they went up there and they enjoyed it so much that Mary went back the following year in 1864 And Robert joined her because he was in college at that point at Harvard. So it wasn't that far to get to Manchester, Vermont. And she still loved it so much and this Equinox Hotel that she reserved to come back the following year. And this time she was going to bring Lincoln. Well, the summer of 1865 didn't happen for Lincoln because he was assassinated in April. So she never went back there. Now, interestingly enough, Robert went back there. Um, Robert went back there in later on in his life when he's a lawyer in Chicago. He ended up becoming a law partner with a guy named Isham, and Isham had property there in family property there in Manchester. So Robert would come and they would spend summers. And Robert loved it so much, he bought the property next door to Isham's and created what's called Hildene, which was Robert Lincoln's summer home. So all of this comes together because the Equinox Hotel still exists. They've expanded over, they still have the old buildings. I've stayed in those buildings a couple of times and they're beautiful. And in fact, I'll be there the first weekend of May because the Lincoln Forum will hold its second annual spring forum symposium at Hildene. And part of it takes place in Equinox Hotel and the rest of it takes place at Hildene. So it's a beautiful area. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. And as of making this video, you can probably still get into this May meeting. So that was all the stuff going on in Manchester, and Robert ended up being there forever. Now, I mentioned in the Maine video that Maine helped Lincoln become president. And Vermont also played a pretty significant role in helping Lincoln become president. Again, when they had the Republican National Convention in Chicago in 1860, all of the voting for the candidates starts from east to west. So Maine went first, and I think New Hampshire was second, and Vermont. And in the first round, Vermont gave all of its 10 votes to Jacob Collamer, who was previously a congressman. He had been Zachary Taylor's postmaster general and at the time was a senator for Vermont. He was their native son. So the first round, all 10 of their votes went to Jacob Collamer, knowing that he had no chance. And in fact, those 10 votes, those are the only 10 votes he ever got. So they knew they weren't going to continue to vote for him. In the second round, in the second balloting, they changed all 10 of those votes to Lincoln. And as with Maine and New Hampshire, those votes made a pretty big difference because Seward is senator for New York right next door. He assumed that New York would all vote for him. I mean, New England would all vote for him. If not on the first round, they would all shift to him in the second round. And in fact, that's not what happened. They shifted to Lincoln instead. So after the second round, Lincoln had about 181 votes, and Seward was about 184. So he had gained a little bit, but Lincoln had jumped from 102 up to 181. And then the third round, the shift kept moving even more. So Vermont did play a role in helping create that momentum for Lincoln to be the clear alternative to Seward, and eventually, of course, got the nomination. So that's all I'm going to talk about tonight for Vermont. I have more about Vermont and Hildene and the whole area in the book. The next video, I'm going to look at my home state of Massachusetts, which played a much bigger role in Lincoln's life and making him who Lincoln is, who we know is Lincoln. So the next video, we'll talk about that. So see you then.